What's up, everybody? Welcome to Wise Guy Gazette. Today I'm going to be doing a quick head-to-head between the SN004 and the SN0138 by San Martin. So these are both dive style watches. They're both taking inspiration from similar watches. They have some slight aesthetic differences in terms of the handset, the color obviously, but they are really similar and they're available in the same price range. So I feel like this is a pretty fair comparison between these two watches. I'm going to start with the price, and I'm going to be going off of the current prices on AliExpress. I believe there's a sale going on right now, so don't expect to always get them at this price, but this is representative of kind of their normal pricing. The SN0138 is $194 right now, and the SN004 is $184. I believe that the normal pricing is usually about $20 to $10 apart, but I think that you'd be paying more like $220 for the SN0138 and maybe $210 for the SN004. So I broke this comparison down into a couple categories, and I'm going to give these watches a score on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how I feel that the watches perform in these different categories. And a lot of this stuff is subjective, but I do try to give my reasoning after each score. So with that being said, I'm going to dive in and start with the crystal. The crystal on both of these is a top hat sapphire crystal. They both have blue AR coating. The only difference between them is that the SN0138 is a double dome crystal, while the SN004 is a single domed. So what that means is you'll get a little bit more reflections on the SN004, and you will get some distortion at extreme angles when you're looking at the dial. So I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but the hands and the indices are slightly distorted as I turn this crystal, whereas on the SN0138, it's relatively clear all the way until the crystal disappears, or I should say until the dial and the handset disappear. So that's one of the main differences between the crystals, and in my opinion, the double dome crystal is better for handling reflections and the lack of distortion, but I don't find that there's a huge difference in practice between these two. They're both really good clarity. They're both high quality crystals. And so I gave the SN004 an 8 out of 10 and the SN0138 a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the hands. The handsets on these are stylistically different. On the SN004, I have the mill sub version, which has sword hands, whereas the SN0138 has typical snowflake style hands, typical of a Tudor Black Bay. And I'm not going to get too much into the aesthetic differences because the SN004 is available with snowflake style hands, but I do want to touch on some details that I did notice. The only thing I really noticed was that the SN004 minute hand reaches out to the minute track a little bit better than the SN0138. So the second hand on both reaches out to the minute track really nicely. The hour hand is pretty similar in proportion. However, the minute hand on this one, the SN004, is just a touch longer and reaches out to the minute track and passes right over those indices. So I do prefer that. So in terms of the handset, I gave the SN004 an 8 and the SN0138 a 7. Moving on to the dial. The dial on these two is pretty different in terms of texture and obviously color. The SN004, I did get the glossy black mill sub version. There is a regular Black Bay version in black and blue, so you can get it with a matte dial. But in this case, I'll be comparing the glossy dial of the SN004 to the matte blue dial of the SN0138. And I'm just going to start with the rating. I gave the SN0138 a 7 and the SN004 an 8. In terms of the actual texture, I'm not going to compare on stylistic differences, but I do prefer the printed logo on the SN004. I believe the printed logo just looks better in more lighting situations. The applied logo on the SN0138, in some lighting it looks pretty good, but in others it just looks like a reflective silver chunk of metal on the dial, so I don't really love that look in most lighting. And in terms of the dial quality itself, they're both really high quality. The powdery blue dial on the SN0138 has a nice matte finish. It matches the bezel. It looks really good. The glossy black on the SN004 Also looks really great, completely inky black, a little bit reflective, but in a nice way, and just gives it a really good classy black diver look. Moving on to the case finishing, I'm going to separate the case design and the case finishing from each other. So starting with the case finishing, I gave them both a 9 out of 10. They both have that typical San Martin level of finishing, high quality brushing, high quality transitions. The polishing looks really good. I couldn't really find any differences in terms of the quality of those different case finishing aspects between these two. But in terms of the case design, there is kind of a difference between the mid case on these two. And this is one of the biggest differences between these two models. A lot of people do complain about the SN0138 and how thick the mid case is. You know, I do prefer the undercut case of the SN004. And I'll put calipers on these in a second, but they do measure at pretty much the exact same thickness. But you will see that the SN0138 appears thicker due to that mid case. Whereas in the case of the SN004, it's a little bit slimmer in the mid case and a little bit thicker in the case back. So the case back kind of buries into your wrist. So the end effect is that the SN004 wears thinner on the wrist and in my opinion looks better. And so I did give the case design on the SN004 an 8 while I only gave a 6 to the SN0138. Moving on to the movement, this is another area where the watches are basically the same. They both have an NH35 movement. There's subtle differences between the two copies that I have. The SN004 in my case is a little bit smoother to wind. The crown threads engage a little bit nicer. But again, that's probably more of a QC issue rather than a difference between the two movements. So I gave those both a 7. And bezel action, again, I did separate bezel into two different categories, actually 3. I separated it into bezel action, bezel grip, and bezel insert. So starting with the bezel action, I gave the SN0138 an 8 and the SN004 a 9. The reason being is that they're very similar. They're both very tactile, but the SN004 has a little bit more resistance, which I do prefer. In this case, I don't like high resistance, but the SN0138 is honestly pretty loose in terms of its movement. I do find that it does move itself throughout the day sometimes, or for example, if I come out of the shower and dry myself off, sometimes the towel will snag this bezel and turn it a little bit. The SN004, I don't really have that problem, so I do prefer the action on the SN004. I'm going to give you guys a quick preview of what they sound like. They're pretty tactile, a little bit higher pitched in nature, and they both feel good, but like I said, the SN004 is a little bit higher resistance. So as you heard, they both have pretty tactile bezel actions, but I do prefer the SN004 for being slightly tighter. Moving on to bezel grip, this is one of the other differentiators between these two models. The SN0138 has a little bit more aggressive of a bezel knurling. They're both kind of coin edge style, but the SN0138 has larger coin notches, and also they're a little bit sharper cut. The bezel grip on both of them is satisfactory, but the SN0138 does provide better grip when you're just trying to turn the bezel with your hands. It does grip other things easier too, which is a downside, but in terms of just bezel grip, I gave the SN0138 a 9 and the SN004 an 8 out of 10. Moving on to the last section regarding the bezel insert, I did give the SN0138 a 9 in this category, and I gave the SN004 an 8 in this category. The reason being is that the bezel insert on the SN0138 is a little bit more unique in terms of being a matte ceramic insert. It's a little bit wider and looks a little bit better and more true to the original Black Bay. And in terms of loom, they're both only loomed on the pip, so there's no difference there. And overall, I just think that the execution on the SN0138 is a little bit better on the bezel insert. They're both high quality, but the SN004 does have that slightly thinner insert, and the glossy black ceramic is really nothing too unique, so I really do prefer the SN0138 in this category. In terms of end links, they both have really good end link fitment. They fit the bracelet pretty seamlessly, but the SN0138 is just better in this category. It's more seamless along the curve of the lugs. It fits a little bit tighter with smaller gaps. And they both have no rattle, but in terms of aesthetics, the SN0138 gets a 9, the SN004 gets a 7. I did break this up into two categories, bracelet and bracelet finishing. That would be kind of the finishing on the bracelet versus just the design itself. These are both the exact same bracelet, so I'm not going to get into it, but I gave them an 8 for the bracelet design and a 9 for the bracelet finishing. San Martin has really well finished bracelets for the price. The bracelet's a pretty uninspired design, just a typical oyster style, but I do really like the way it feels. It's really well finished. It feels buttery smooth on the wrist. So these are just good bracelets for the price range, probably the best you'll find in the $200 range. And that's truly one of the strengths of San Martin. They have really good bracelets for the price, and they are pretty consistent. So I did give these the exact same score. And then moving on to the clasp, that's the exact same story. They both have San Martin's on-the-fly adjustable clasp where you can lengthen and shorten the clasp as needed without any tools. So you just push in, and then you have a button on the other side, and you can deploy it back out. So these are very easy to use. They're well finished. They're all fully milled, and this is pretty standard on these San Martin watches. So no difference there. They both get a 9 out of 10. Now I'm moving on to the last category, which is fit. Again, this is super subjective, but in terms of fit, I do find that the SN004 fits me a little bit better. They're the same dimensions in the lug-to-lug distance. The SN004 has 1 more millimeter in diameter, and the main difference is the thickness of the mid case. The SN004 has a little bit more turned down to the lugs, and it has a thinner mid case. So for those reasons, I just find that it wears a little bit better on my wrist. I don't have the biggest wrist, so I do like that it wears thin and low profile, whereas the SN0138 is a little bit chunkier on wrist and gives me a little bit more of a top-heavy feeling rather than the SN004, which kind of sinks into the wrist and fits really nicely. So in terms of fit, I'm going to give the SN004 an 8 and the SN0138 a 7. They both fit really nicely. They're both meant for small wrists, but I do find that the SN004 has a better mid case, and that thinner profile just looks a little bit better on wrist. All right, so wrapping up, that gives us a total for the SN0138 of 112 points out of 140 possible. That's an 80% score. The SN004 scored 113 points out of 140, giving it an 81%. So in terms of the raw score, the SN004 did come out ahead just by a tiny bit. But with that being said, depending on the weight that you put in each category, you might find that you prefer one watch over the other. So I do encourage you to just take the scores, look at what matters to you, and just decide what you think would be the best watch for you. And I know this isn't an apples to apples comparison because I'm looking at a black versus a blue, mil sub versus a regular black bay, but I hope this was helpful in terms of making a decision between these two watches. I know that they're in the same price category and they look very similar, but I wanted to touch on some of the subtle differences that set these two watches apart to help you make a decision if you're not leaning one way or the other. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe. I'll be bringing more content like this to you guys. And if you like this format, just let me know. I'm happy to do some more head-to-head watch reviews. These are pretty easy and quick to produce, but I think they provide some good value. So just let me know in the comments, and I'll be happy to produce whatever you guys are looking for. So have a great day, and I appreciate you watching.